Taking a look at the latest developments, we see that the Ukrainians are continuing the pressure on three parts of the front line. But what is their actual objectives on these 3 points of the front line? So according to the latest information and the reports by the Institute for the Study of War, the Ukrainian strategy in Bakhmut, as well as in the northern parts of the Zaporizhia area / Donetsk area, is not their offensive. This is not part of this offensive. This offensive here is to push down to the SFC or capture Municipal, Berdiansk, Tokmak, whichever. That is their offensive in and of itself. So we have the offensive here. Then what are these two? According to the Institute for the Study of War, these two are focused on one thing, and that is to draw Russian troops into the northern parts. The objective of the Bakhmut front and the Remelsky Lech area is to prevent the Russian forces from focusing all of their equipment on the southern front. Because if the Russian forces fully man these trenches, 5 lines of defense, then the Ukrainians will have an even harder time advancing. And as we have seen so far, they have managed to advance through the first line of defense, but not break through it yet. As such, if the Russians had more troops there, more equipment, more weapons, more ammunition, and so on, the Ukrainians would have an even harder time. So according to the Institute for the Study of War, the Ukrainian strategy is to attack in 3 different directions: direction of Bakhmut, Remelsky Lech, and Zaporizhia at the same time, is all to divert the Russian resources so that they cannot man these areas fully, and instead have to divert their resources to the areas here to the south and to the east of the front, both in Bakhmut and the Remelsky Lech area. And this has in part succeeded, because the Russian forces were forced to send further troops and reinforcements to these areas so that they were able to face the Ukrainian forces. However, the issue here lies with the fact that the Russians have superior firepower, and they have more troops now. With this, the Ukrainian forces end up trying to divert and split up the Russian forces when they do not have the necessary amount of firepower and manpower to do so. According to the Art of War, the side that needs to split up their own army is the larger army, the one with twice as many troops as the opponent. If not, then you can offer battle by the front, and preferably at a part where neither side is on the offensive or defensive, but at neutral grounds. Otherwise, you just have to defend, because when you're defending, you can have a disadvantage in numbers and firepower and still be able to put up a fight. But if you're attacking, you need to have the advantage. And currently, the Ukrainians do not have that advantage. By splitting up the front, spreading around the whole area, there are more parts where they can fight. And the larger the area of fighting is, the more troops can be put into the front. So essentially, instead of using 100,000 troops in this part of the front, they're using 200 or 300,000 troops across the whole front. And instead of being on the defensive, they are on the offensive in all 3 parts of the front. So the Ukrainian forces have 200 to 300,000 troops engaged in these parts of the front, and all of them are attacking, whether they are having an advantage in firepower, manpower, or not. According to leaked information, so I'm not going to put a lot of weight on it, but essentially, according to hearsay, rumors, whatever you want to call it, low credibility information, the Western officials kept asking Ukraine to focus their forces in the south instead of splitting up the forces and launching attacks in the Bakhmut direction. The reason for this is if the Ukrainians concentrate their forces more, they're able to concentrate their firepower as well, which is limited. If the Russians are using 10 to 15,000 artillery shells a day across the whole front, and the Ukrainians are using 5,000 across the whole front, if they then split up their artillery across the whole front, then they have little concentration. But if they concentrate everything in this small part, then suddenly the difference is much smaller. Of course, it will give Russia a huge advantage in other parts of the front because they're focusing most of their ammunition in one place. But again, this will allow the Ukrainians to have a much higher chance for success because currently the difference in firepower, the difference in manpower, and the difference between the attacker and the defender, and the difference in the fortifications here in the south all give Russia a huge advantage. And this is why we're seeing so little advances despite the offensive going on for 3.5 months. Which brings us to this tweet here by David Sachs. Ukrainian territorial gains from their much vaunted counteroffensive, highlighted in blue, as you can clearly see, are so minuscule they can barely be seen on a map. David T. Pine, who is an American former US Army HQ staff officer, Russian and national security expert. This is the assessed control of terrain in Ukraine according to the Institute for the Study of War, and if we go in, we can see that there are some tiny specks of advances. This is the Robotyne direction, this is the Lubkova direction, and this is the Remevsky area. We can hardly see the advances, and Elon Musk replies to that, so much death for so little. This is a play on the quote by Winston Churchill, where he in the Second World War said, "Never has so much been owed to so few." This is basically the opposite of that. Never has so little been owed to so many. So we see exactly how much it is that Ukraine has managed to recapture in numbers. We see this is a graph by Warmapper. He has said Russia controlled 7% of Ukrainian territory prior to the February invasion. Then in the first month of February, they captured 10.75%. In March, they captured 7.88%. With the withdrawal from the Kyiv area, the Ukrainians recaptured 5.5%. Then for another 4 months, hardly anything changed. Then we see the Kherson and Kharkiv counteroffensives, which saw Ukraine gain about 2.5%. And then since then, the territory has hardly changed. The Ukrainians have managed to, since May, recapture 0.08% of Ukrainian territory. That is less than 0.1%. That is after 4 months of fighting and hardly any results. And the worst part of this is not that it is because the Ukrainians were poorly equipped, not that it was the Ukrainians poorly trained, not that they were few in numbers, not of any of those reasons. The reason is poor planning. The Ukrainian forces took a decision to launch an offensive in an area where there was little to no chance for success. You can say, well, you're not an expert, you're just a YouTuber, you're young, you're naive, you don't know that much about warfare, you have no military experience. You can come with all of these reasons, all of these criticisms to me and to my credibility. But in the end, I predicted this outcome. I expected Ukraine would not be able to break through. And it is very clear that the reason for all of this is because the Ukrainians were not nearly prepared enough to launch such an offensive. If the Ukrainians needed to succeed in this offensive, they would have to either, one, have fought before the Russians built their fortifications, all the way back to October of last year, November of last year. But back then they didn't have all of their tanks, they didn't have all of their equipment that they needed for such an offensive. They got this in late April. Back then, the Ukrainians could not launch the offensive due to poor weather. There was rain, there was mud, not a suitable situation for an offensive. They launched it instead in early June, specifically the 4th of June. At that point, the Russians had essentially finished most of their defenses. They had properly supplied, stocked up on their supplies, sent troops to the front, and all of the necessary things to prepare for Ukrainian offensive. It was clear all the way back in January that the Ukrainians would launch their offensive here in the Zaporizhzhia front. I've made multiple videos talking about how, why, when, where, and all of these things for the Ukrainian offensive. I always said the Ukrainians would not launch it in spring because the weather is too terrible in spring. As soon as summer began, they launched their offensive. There are so many factors that made it so that in the end, the small minuscule differences, whether it's June 4th or June 24th, whether it is in the Rumelsky Ledge area, whether it is in Orehiv, whether it's Holyaypole, all of these things didn't matter because the Russians had prepared for every single one of those options. The Ukrainians ended up sending 150,000 troops to a pre-planned destruction zone where the Russians had multiple lines of defense, they had minefields, they had air force, they had everything they needed to prevent such an offensive. And in the end, they have prevented it because the Ukrainians have spent 3.5 months launching an offensive, and so far they have gained 0.08% of Ukrainian territory back. They have managed to capture Andriivka and Klishchivka south of Bakhmut, in an area where their apparent objective is to divert Russian troops. But in the end, the Russians had enough troops to, despite this diversion, do their own diversion in the Luhansk area, where the Ukrainians sent 3 to 4 brigades that were dedicated to this offensive to Luhansk instead, to Kupiansk, to Kreminna. So the Russian forces are definitely not running low on ammunition or infantry because they have extra capacity. They're able to rotate their troops. They are not running low on ammunition at the front. The Ukrainian soldiers on the front are feeling that. Yet we're seeing article after article from Western sources claiming this and that about NATO ammunition, about the Ukrainian supply of ammunition, how the Black Sea grain deal ended, the Russians started their blockade, the Ukrainians have managed to destroy ship after ship, submarine after submarine, but all of these haven't ended the blockade. The Ukrainians have not been able to receive weapons and ammunition from the Black Sea now. So the only way the Ukrainians are receiving ammunition and supplies is through Romania, Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia. There's all land-based supply, and land-based supply is significantly worse than sea-based supply. This is why the Russians decided to end the Black Sea grain deal at such an opportune moment when the offensive is underway, because a sudden delay in ammunition slows down the Ukrainian offensive. So despite losing ship after ship, which are billions of dollars of damage and many years of repair or replacement, they are in a situation where just these few tons of ammunition being delayed for Ukraine's front is allowing them to delay the Ukrainian offensive further, and every delay puts Ukraine closer and closer to the mud season. And when the muddy season begins, Ukraine's offensive comes to a halt. So the Russian objective is one thing and one thing only, as is stated by Zelensky himself. The only thing Putin wants is to fight for a long time. He is ready for a long war. Meanwhile, Ukraine is, according to Zelensky, it's not an easy path. It won't be, I'm sure. I can say where it's faster, I can't talk about it, because I know where we're going to break through and break through powerfully. So Zelensky is looking for a breakthrough. He's looking for a speed run. He's looking for something similar to Kharkiv and Kherson, when the Russians retreated from Kherson, or when they were pushed out of Kharkiv. That is what he's looking for, and he's saying it's coming. We're all waiting for it. They've been saying it for 3.5 months. Now Zelensky is saying it on a CNN, CBC, CBS News interview. But we have yet to see it on the front. Now that he said it, I now expect to see something. At least an attempt. If this attempt fails, the rainy season begins. The muddy season begins, and Ukraine's long-awaited offensive that they prepared for over half a year has ended with 0.08% of territory regained, for the loss of hundreds of thousands of troops. Not necessarily killed, not necessarily wounded, all of these things. But the fact that hundreds of thousands were prepared and it didn't receive any success, that begs the question, how many millions will they then need to break through Russia's defensive lines? How many years will they need to break through Russia's defensive lines? Germany is pledging that they'll so far agree to support them until 2032. That's another 9 years. Are we looking into another decade-long war? Will Ukraine be able to hold out for another 10 years? With 40% of their economy slashed away, with tens million refugees abroad. There are so many things that are playing against Ukraine. And in the end, all they have to support them, what the Ukrainians are reliant on, is the support of Western countries. If tomorrow all of the Western countries backing Ukraine stops backing them, stop sending them weapons, then Ukraine will not be able to resupply themselves. They do not have the necessary industrial capacity to fight a war. They are heavily reliant on the West. If the West stops their support, Ukraine can do nothing but lose the war. So as long as the Western countries support Ukraine, Ukraine has a fighting chance. But the longer the war goes on, the smaller a chance there is of the war continuing. Because, for example, the US election will take place, and if Donald Trump, for example, is elected, then we may see the United States pull out their support. Because Donald Trump has said he prefers the war to stop over Ukraine winning. Then we have other possibilities. Who is to say that we don't get another Viktor Orban in Germany, France, the UK? We have hardly even seen support from France, Italy, and Spain. They have each sent about $1 billion in military support. In comparison, a country like Denmark, much smaller than those three, have sent more than $4 billion by itself, more than these three countries combined. So France, Italy, and Spain are not even interested in supporting Ukraine as much as is needed. And even the supply of ammunition is not even able to keep up with the Russians. The Russians are producing more artillery shells than all of the Western countries combined at a yearly basis. So Russia will not run out of ammunition before Ukraine. That is one thing for sure. They've even made a deal with North Korea about buying millions of shells. The West doesn't even produce 1 million in a year. So there are so many things playing against Ukraine, and if they do not see any success soon, then the support for Ukraine will keep dwindling. It doesn't matter how many artillery pieces Ukraine has, if they do not have the ammunition to use them. And that is where I'll end up this video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.